welcome to this edition of Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Councilwoman Helen Rosenthal, and I represent the Upper West Side in the New York City Council. Today we'll be talking about how climate change is impacting and will impact New York City, what city government is doing to respond, and how we as residents can assist in those vitally important efforts. Joining me today is the man leading New York City's response to climate change, Daniel Zarrilli, Senior Director of Climate Policy and Programs and Chief Resilience Officer in the Mayor's Office. Thank you very much for being here today, Dan. I really appreciate your coming on.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, you know, this weekend, 200,000 people marched in D.C., and probably a quarter of them were from the Upper West Side. People come into my office all the time asking, what can they do? You know, I spoke at the Earth Day rally last weekend talking about climate change and some of the steps the city is doing. But, you know, people are tired of writing postcards or going to marches. They want to do something. And what I'm interested in hearing from you about is whether or not their efforts to change light bulbs, compost, recycle, is that meaningful? Or what else could people be doing?
Oh, thanks. I think it's really inspiring that 200,000 people marched. The weekend before, scientists marched through D.C. and in New York City. And I really think that the efforts that people are taking to raise their voices, to say no, to say this is important to me, is I ultimately will win the day. Right now, we're in a bit of a dark period.
Yeah.
And the rollback of environmental regulations and climate action is, the drumbeat continues. But I truly think that by raising our voices and saying no, we're going to make a difference. What people can also do in their own lives makes a difference as well. And the efforts to recycle, compost, change light bulbs, but also take it a step further and think about securing renewable energy, thinking about electrifying their heat and hot water, electrifying their vehicles and transportation. All of it makes a big difference. And I would encourage people to continue doing it. We have resources to that extent with the city government, with our Green NYC program, and so they can follow Birdie, our mascot, on Twitter, but they can go to nyc.gov/greenyc and get lots of tips on how they can participate in this and help improve their neighborhood, their quality of life, and take climate action.
What is the city doing to deal with climate change?
Sure. So Mayor de Blasio came into office and recognized the moral imperative of acting on climate change. And we released a strategy called One NYC, the Plan for a Strong and Just City, that really recognizes that we face a number of challenges. We're a growing city and our population is growing. We have increased inequality. We have aging infrastructure, and our climate is changing on us. And that has a threat to our people, our infrastructure, our neighborhoods. And it comes through in sort of what I think of as the first order effects. We know that it's going to get hotter, there's going to be more rain, we're going to see more days over 90 degrees in New York City. That could triple by 2050 from what it is today. And of course, sea levels are continuing to rise. We've already seen a foot of sea level rise in New York City since 1900. We're projecting that by the 2050s, that could be as high as 2.5 feet. By 2100, that could be 6 feet.
Wow.
And those are the high-end projections right now from the New York City Panel on Climate Change. So all of that is sort of the first impacts that we could see. But then the real, I guess I think of as the second impact is when that starts to impact people's neighborhoods, their public health, food security, and the challenges that'll bring to our city. And so it's incredibly important for us to really approach it in two ways. One is we need to make sure that we are reducing our own contributions to the causes of climate change. And we've made a major commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in New York City, 80% by 2050. And at the same time, we need to adapt to the inevitable effects that we're going to see from climate change. So by staying in the Paris Agreement, by meeting our commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we can limit the effects. But we're already going to see some, which is why we're investing over $20 billion in a comprehensive resiliency program across the city to deal with the rising seas, the coastal storms, the increased heat that we're going to see in New York City.
Well, so let's break it down. I'm not a scientist. So rising, how much emissions that New York City puts out? What's the biggest way that New Yorkers are involved in making that happen? It's
Sure.
our homes, right?
It's buildings. So we have 1 million buildings across New York City, and in their totality that account for about 2/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions. which is substantial and different than many other cities where transportation accounts for the bigger portion of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're blessed with an effective transit system, and it's been in place, and people use it. And so our buildings become the next major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions.
I was really proud to be a prime sponsor on the Green Building Code legislation that passed. One thing that I liked about it was that it's not only about new buildings going up, that they have to be well insulated, for example, and follow other Green Building Code measures. But I liked it because in some of the alterations that happen, it gives us an opportunity to go back and retrofit some buildings as well. What's the distinction there in terms of what type of alterations would fall into the category of you only can get a building permit if you do certain green measures?
Well, right. And so thank you for your support on that. I think the efforts to green our buildings is only going to become more and more important. And we are attacking it in two different ways, where we are driving down standards on new construction, but we know that 80% of the buildings that exist today are still going to be here in 2050.
Right.
So that focus on retrofits becomes even more important. And we've already, the legislation you're talking about that increases the standards for lighting retrofits, sub-meters, benchmarking, just to make sure we understand how much energy our buildings are using. And we need to continue to increase those standards. The major focus is really going to be getting fossil fuels out of New York City and electrifying our buildings. Our heat and hot water in particular are a big challenge. So it's boiler retrofits, it's insulation, it's the kind of work that we need to do to make sure our buildings can continue functioning, but we're transitioning to more renewable sources of electricity that can power our buildings.
So NYCHA is a perfect example, right? That's something under our control to some degree. Are we retrofitting the boilers in the NYCHA buildings? It's 300,000 units, I think.
I don't have the unit number. I know that NYCHA is an incredible leader in sustainability, and they've just recently released their NYCHA Next Gen plan. They're taking action both to drive their energy use down, and they're doing that in partnership with HUD. And at the same time, they are also leading a $3 billion adaptation program in their post-Sandy context to make sure that they're better prepared across their coastal neighborhoods for the impacts of flooding and other risks.
Yeah, I saw that. After Sandy, we went and tried to help out. The flooding was unbelievable,
right,
and the way it just shut everything down. I know that in some neighborhoods, they're still dealing with like in Sunset Park, the boiler problems. Or do you have a sense on that? You know, what the timing is to get all of that fixed? And are they moving boilers up to, or generators up to the top floor? How are they dealing with that?
So many buildings, and NYCHA falls into this category, are elevating their boilers. There's been a really interesting series going on in the New York Times by David Dunlap that's talking about how buildings are putting their boilers in some cases up on the roof.
Yeah.
And NYCHA is doing the exact same thing in their coastal neighborhoods and making sure they're removing that risk from the floodplain by elevating their boilers, their critical systems, and installing flood protection. It's just so vitally important to keep the power on and make sure people don't get stranded on high floors, and they can get up and down, and first responders can get to them in those instances. And so that is a key function of building our more resilient city, is making sure that we can withstand those impacts, and they're a lot less. And our first responders are continuing to improve and be able to serve in that capacity as well.
Tell me about the Big U. This is one of the things the city dreamed up in order to protect, I don't know, Staten Island as well, but certainly downtown Manhattan.
So
what's the Big U?
Right, so after Sandy, the city put forward a coastal protection plan that is really in all 5 boroughs, and so there's components in Manhattan, but also Staten Island, in and around Jamaica Bay, and Coney Island, Hunts Point, and other parts of the city. And we are continuing to move forward with the design and the planning of that work. We are working closely with the community, first in the Lower East Side, to make sure that we're planning that project in the right way, largely utilizing East River Park. And then we secured additional federal funds to take that further south into 2 bridges, and we're doing also some of the additional work that's necessary in Lower Manhattan around the tip to Battery Park City as well.
So could you make this very graphic for us? When I hear the Big U, I think, what is that? A wall that's going to come up and is going to be in the water to protect Manhattan, southern Manhattan, physically, what is it?
You could probably think of it as a berm or a levee. It's, we're trying to achieve as much passive flood protection as possible, but do it in a way that integrates into the neighborhood and really utilizes better urban design, so it doesn't feel like that wall that cuts you off from the waterfront. And so part of the project is expanding access to East River Park as well and improving the bridges so that people just see it as a natural feature of the park, but when you need it, it also serves as that flood protection. And so that's been a driving goal for the project. And then there are other areas where we need to get across streets and things, and there are some deployable gates and gates that close. But in large part, especially in the park, it's going to be a very passive feature.
The berm.
Right.
Can you explain for people what a berm is?
It's, I think the term levee, berm, I've been reduced to describing it as basically a hill in the past, and it's just some elevated landscaping that can serve as our flood protection.
And where are we in that project?
We are doing well. We are moving aggressively. It's a very complex project, and we're dealing with some issues really for the first time in terms of integrating flood protection into a dense urban environment like Manhattan. And so we are heading towards some of the land use actions that are necessary, and we're heading into final design. So that's moving. I think we'll see, we're hoping to get into a groundbreaking late 2018, early 2019, I believe at this point.
And that would be on the East River side?
That would be, it'd be in the Lower East Side, roughly from 25th Street down to Montgomery Street for that first phase.
Right, I remember those areas were really hard hit.
Right.
But also Battery Park. So what's the thought there?
So that's why we did secure additional money for the two bridges, so taking it from Montgomery Street down to the Brooklyn Bridge, and then the mayor put $100 million in the budget a year ago in order to make sure that we are continuing to advance the planning and design work, and so that we can continue to build south of the Brooklyn Bridge, down around the tip of the Battery, as well as up to the northern end of Battery Park City.
How long should that take?
This is going to take a couple of years. We're still securing some of the money we need. We are advancing the planning. We're working very closely with community boards, 1 and 3, through the planning of these projects to make sure that we get to a project that people like, that fits into the neighborhood, that is, but that also provides that protection that's necessary.
So people can go to their community board meetings and speak up about it, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. How do they find out about that? Do you know?
So we have a project website, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but we can certainly share that with you afterwards. And there's resources online that tell you when we're posting those meeting notices, and we also post them on our Twitter account as well, at NY Climate.
Can you say it again? It's at NY?
NYC LIMATE.
Very clever.
Yes.
And similarly, you have a Facebook page, or?
We do not. We're on Twitter.
Okay.
We're on Instagram.
So another bill that passed recently that I was also proud to be a sponsor of is the Environmental Justice Impact. Environmental Justice Plan. And basically the idea is that we want to make sure that the neighborhoods that live right next door to a power plant, are getting relief quickly. Tell me more about the plan.
Absolutely, and so we were thrilled to work with WeAct, with other environmental justice groups, with neighborhoods on the passage of that legislation, which just happened the past 2 weeks ago. The mayor signed it into law last Tuesday, and we're really thrilled about that because it really brings to bear the mayor's equity agenda into our climate change work and really broadly into a lot of the decision making that happens across the city. And so we're going to be working to set up an advisory group where the agencies are going to be working to develop environmental justice plans to really bring that environmental justice framework and lens into future decision making, really with the knowledge that there have been historic injustices that have happened in many communities, and we don't want to have that happen. We want to move forward and make sure that the benefits and the concerns from environmental actions are shared equally across the city.
Can I just ask just a common sense question? You and I probably in our mind's eye can think of a number of those exact communities, right, that are suffering because power plants or a sewage plant or a waste plant has been put in their backyard, Upper Manhattan, for example. What are we doing today to make that better for them? Like, because we don't need a plan to know some of the more obvious communities. What can we do now?
Well, I think that the focus is really on the decisions that are going to be in front of us going forward. We want to make sure we're bringing that perspective into our decision making, so we're not making those same mistakes again. Some of them are hard to undo, and we're not, it's not necessarily that it's going to be picking up a wastewater treatment plant. Those largely need to be where they are for gravity-fed engineering reasons. But the way that we are interacting with communities, the way that we're bringing in community and voices into future decisions, really to help empower communities and bring them into the process is what these bills are about, and making sure that we can not make the same mistakes that we've made in the past.
You know, in the waste treatment plant near Asphalt Green on the Upper East Side, my understanding is we're using the latest technology to make the most up-to-date technology to make sure there aren't noise problems, but also there aren't pollution problems. Can we retrofit all of the waste treatment plants in Greenpoint, in Brooklyn, Williamsburg? Can we retrofit those to make sure those communities are protected as well?
Well, so the city's own facilities and the marine transfer stations that you're referring to, really achieving borough equity and how we handle our waste, but definitely using the best technology, containerizing the waste, putting it on barges, getting it off the streets. Just critically important for neighborhood air quality benefits and just pollution concerns. The private infrastructure that's out there, I'm less aware of how we might be able to retrofit those, but I know that the technology exists. I think that's
the technology does exist
I mean,
for retrofitting.
It absolutely does, but whether or not we can get there with the private operators, I think it's something to explore.
Thank you. I want to talk about renewable sources of energy just for a minute. What is the city doing to increase our usage of renewables like solar and wind?
Right, and so I think the city in this place really leads by example. And not only are we retrofitting our own buildings, and we have $2.6 billion in the budget to retrofit every single municipal building. We've set some targets for solar, and we've already achieved, as a city, 105 megawatts of installed solar. We have a target that we want to see 1,000 megawatts by 2030, and we're moving really the gears of government to be able to make that happen and to make the permitting process more predictable. So a lot of great things happening there. And the same with electric vehicles, where we're leading by example with our own fleet. We're going to have 1,000 vehicles on the road, and we're exploring ways to expand charging infrastructure across the city. So it really starts with what we do, and then I think it scales out to the rest of the city from there.
You know, we talk about these things in sort of grand statements. We're going from 100 megawatts to 1,000 megawatts. We're solarizing, this many buildings. We had a hearing on this a couple of months ago, and one of the things that was so interesting to me was, when does the city contract this work out, and when do we do it ourselves? When is it an opportunity for green jobs, for example? Has your office gotten involved in that at all?
So even just last Saturday, the mayor stood up and announced our partnership with the Building and Construction Trades Council on a new green jobs initiative, where we're going to be leveraging our own investments in energy efficiency retrofits, those $2.6 billion that we have, to make sure that we are training 3,000 New Yorkers over the next 3 years to participate in this work. And we need to grow the workforce, because there's going to be clear demand for the types of work that we're talking about. On solar, I think we're exploring ways to continue to expand that as we're looking at different ways of procuring the solar. Really,
I am digging down into procurement for a moment.
Right. And so I mean, we are certainly interested in expanding green jobs, and this happens through our Cool Roofs program. It happens through our Green Jobs Corps. We've been doing it with bioswale, maintaining jobs at DEP. There's a broad array of opportunities that we want to drive people through our Workforce One centers at the Small Business Services Department.
One of the big questions from this hearing, I'm chair of contracts, so I do deep dives into the weeds in order to help us better understand sort of the idea of how are we really going to get to more solar or more wind. And one of the things we found was there was a question about what the depreciation is on solar for roofs and how long they last, and whether or not it's better for this to be city-owned energy, where we put in the costs up front and reap 100% of the benefits, compared to using an outside, contractor.
Right.
Have you looked at that at all? Because in the analysis that we looked at, there was an argument for the city doing more. I don't know.
So I think our agencies are looking at that and want to really, as this area continues to grow, we want to make sure we've got the right pathways and the right options. And so we're exploring a couple different ways. But we are committed to green jobs. We are putting our money where our mouth is on that and making sure we're training more and more New Yorkers for those opportunities. And I think we're thrilled to do that. And I want to thank the council for their partnership on this as well.
Did you end up setting up a program at CUNY? That was something we talked about, a green jobs program. So kids who go to CUNY could have access to learning about that and get those jobs.
I mean, I think CUNY has programs. I think there are community organizations that have programs. What we just announced is really about the construction trades and the pathways to middle-class careers and making sure that we are helping New Yorkers who haven't had access in the past to those careers get through the pre-apprenticeship training programs, get apprentices, and get those jobs and become journey workers over time. And that's a real life-changing event for those New Yorkers that participate.
You know, it's interesting. I have there's a high school in this district, and it's called the Brandeis Complex, and they have solar panels, which is great, on their roof. And they apparently have as much as the roof load can bear. And there's a school in that high school that's called, School for Green Careers, but yet they have no access to the roof or learning about, how they could be involved in designing, installing, and maintaining those solar panels. What do I say to those kids?
I think it's an interesting thing that we should try to explore, and I don't know the specifics of the school, obviously, but the opportunity for kids to go up and look, touch, and play and learn from the installation. I mean, it seems like it's a no-brainer, but I don't know the specifics at the school, obviously, and so we can look into it.
I mean, that's why I'm always so interested to dive into the weeds, because it's the difference between talking about it, but the devil is always in the details.
Right.
It's interesting how many hurdles. I mean, I applaud you. Moving, the ship of bureaucracy is something else.
And the Department of Ed has been doing really great work, and they have a sustainability team focused on bringing climate and environmental education into the curriculum, and so they've been doing a lot of great things, but we're certainly happy to look into some more things as well.
I really appreciate that, and we talked about that at the hearing as well. Tell me about the city's natural gas usage and the ongoing overhaul of our natural gas infrastructure. In light of wanting to reduce emissions as one of our goals.
Well, so we know that the transition to natural gas has been a key part of the greenhouse gas emissions that we've achieved to date, but it's not going to be enough if we want to achieve 80 by 50, and so we're continuing to move down the path of deep decarbonization, the retrofitting of buildings, the promotion of electric vehicles, the electrification of buildings. All of that, I think, is going to need to continue to transition away from fossil fuels to meet these targets. And that can't just happen here in New York City as well. That has to happen across the entire globe, which is why we've been promoting solar power and achieving those targets, which is why we've been continuing to pursue offshore wind opportunities that are just now really getting off the ground here in the United States. But we've seen the experience from Europe where it's becoming more and more cost effective, and solar and wind are becoming higher and higher percentages of the grid. But we also need, and something else we've been working on is storage capacity, because the intermittency of those renewables is a challenge. And so we need to find effective baseload, we need to find storage, and the work that the state is doing on its reforming the energy vision. All of this plays a role in how we have distributed energy, how it's better priced, how it's better utilized in order to be able to make renewables continue to be more and more effective.
One complaint I hear from people is we on the Upper West Side, we're a heavily landmarked district. And so if someone owns a brownstone in a landmarked district and wants to change out their windows, for example, in order for them not to leak anymore, it's actually, a ridiculous hurdle. Not ridiculous from LPC's point of view, but that's like one of the tiny things where people just get stopped at that point. Are you working with other agencies in that regard to help them, include in their thinking about approving plans, making sure that, people who just want to insulate their homes better can do so easily?
Well, that's an example of where we want to achieve two things and make sure that we are promoting the better energy efficiency and still protecting the historic nature of those districts. We've been working with the Department of Buildings and really making sure that we are streamlining as much of this process as we can. FDNY, DOB have been increasing their staffing to deal with solar applications, to deal with storage applications, those sort of things. It's exactly what we want to do, is make the process more predictable so that it's not treated as an ad hoc. The historic nature of some buildings makes that more and more of a challenge, but I think there's a process to get through that to achieve two goals.
So reducing the permit process or the permit hurdles at DOB, has the buildings commissioner been able to achieve some of that already?
Oh, I think we've seen that, and I give him a lot of credit because we've been able to move those permit processes. Solar is a great example of this. A couple of years ago, solar was an ad hoc application. It was, if you put it in, they had to deal with it specially. By setting some targets, and we set a target initially of 100 megawatts and 250 in the private sector, and then working to continue to make those permit processes more predictable, we've actually allowed the private market to step in and meet their
250.
And we're on the pathway to achieving those. And so we expanded the target along those lines to make sure that we can and are continuing to work. And then we've taken that lesson to battery storage. And so it's also a part of the permitting process that's a little further behind than what solar is, but we saw the same trajectory where we're going to set some targets, we're going to work to reform our own internal processes, and we want to make sure that the private market can step in and do what it needs to do in a predictable way to achieve those renewable goals.
So I think that is exactly what people want to see. People want to see the roadmap and the exact changes that will be made and how things will be easier for them. So things are predictable.
Yes.
That is one of the biggest complaints that I hear from constituents. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. Unfortunately, it's time to wrap up, and I just want to thank you, Dan. You're obviously thinking very hard about this. On behalf of the mayor, I thank you for that, and also on behalf of all the residents of New York City. Thank you for watching Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Councilwoman Helen Rosenthal.